Welcome back to Mysterious Goings On. You know, in recent years, the nation of Scotland has exploded onto the mystery thriller scene with authors offering a distinctly Scottish take on the crime novel. Often called tarte noir, delighted readers have seen the rise of crime fiction masters including Ian Rankin, William McIlvanney, Louise Welch, and Val McDermid. However, while today's guest is easily part of that clan of writers, he chafes at the colorful tarte noir descriptor. Let's find out more about that, as well as his take on writing several series, true crime, and more, as we meet Douglas Skelton, author of the new thriller Thunder Bay on Mysterious Goings On. Welcome, Douglas.
Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Was I too off base on the tarte noir? I think I read somewhere that you weren't a big fan of that.
I'm not a big fan of the label, and that is exactly what it is. And I understand why it's used, because it's an easy label to use. But the problem with it is that it can lead to quotas. It can lead to people thinking, well, you know, agents, publishers, for instance, I've already got my quota of tarte noir authors, so let's move on to somebody else. And my view is that, you know, there are I'm going to say good books and bad books, and that's totally unfair because everything is subjective. But, you know, the book is either good or you don't think it is, and it shouldn't matter where it's set or where the author is from.
I like that. Why don't we put a pin in that? We might get back to that a little bit more later. Thunder Bay is a hit in Scotland. It's been long listed for Bloody Scotland's McIlvanney Prize for Best Crime Book of the Year, and is shaping up to be the same here in the U.S. with a Publishers Weekly starred review that raves about it, saying it's got exquisite language, credible characters, and unrelenting suspense. This crime novel has it all. And listeners, I have to tell you, I totally agree with that. Having been reading Into Thunder Bay, it's a delight. And but before we get too deep into that, here we go. I want to just kind of get into your bio for a minute. I want everybody to understand and kind of where you come from. And if I can quote from your bio, which I found very amusing and fun, you say, I've been a bank clerk, tax officer, taxi driver for 2 days, wine waiter for 2 hours, journalist and investigator. You've written 11 true crime and Scottish criminal history books, but now, as you say, you're concentrating on fiction, on making things up. And you've also done some stuff, as you say, on the telly very often, which is a scary experience, but more so for the viewer. So yeah. Just looking back on that, I do a little telly myself, but not on a national scale. But so I get that. It's to me, it's always very cringeworthy time for me to see my mug up there. I don't know if you feel the same way.
No, I have a great face for podcasts.
Okay, well, as you said, you started your career writing about true crime. Can you just kind of tell us a little bit about that? What drew you to that?
Well, I was working with a weekly newspaper in Glasgow, in the West End of the city, and I wrote a feature on a series of unsolved murders in Glasgow, which the Evening Times, the city's Evening Times, picked up and ran on the Saturday. And from there, I started to do more of the city's criminal history for that paper. And the features editor at one point said to me, well, he said, I've been reading these things again and we love them, but do you think there's a book in them? And I hadn't thought about that. And he referred me to Mainstream Publishing in Edinburgh, and they accepted the book within days, basically, of me submitting it, and took it on from there. I was very, very lucky. And the luck continued because the boss of Mainstream, Bill Campbell, would phone me up now and again and say, so what have you got for us next? And I would hastily try and think of something to offer him, which he would then accept. Now, I think I was a professional, not a tax dodge, but a tax break for them. The true crime books didn't really sell that well. It certainly didn't make me a lot of money. So I think I was just there for a tax break for the more profitable books. But I did 11 of them. Not all for Mainstream, did them for some other publishers. One was an investigative piece on a miscarriage of justice in Scotland, and I stayed with the campaign for 10 years until the two men who had been convicted of a quite horrendous mass murder in Glasgow in 1984 were cleared by the appeal court. But eventually I got to the stage that I felt guilty turning real life tragedy into what is entertainment.
Yeah.
The Miscarriage of Justice book aside, the rest of them were designed to be entertaining, and I began to feel guilty. So as I was writing the true crime books, I started to go further back and do more historical crimes, which interested me more than the modern stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, and I was a former journalist myself, and you know what always struck me when I've interviewed murderers, I've been into prisons to interview criminals, I've interacted with the criminal justice system in that regard, and just in keeping with what you just said, first of all, usually when I interviewed people who were involved in crimes, the sheer banality of it, first of all. So many of them had such strange personalities that just seemed like a light switch went off, and that's with them, and that was easy for them to do those things. But the other thing too was, it was just overwhelming sadness. So I got to a point where it depressed me too much to really involve myself in crime. So did you find that also that beyond the fact that you didn't really want to profit off of people's misery, but did you find it personally distressing?
Yeah, to an extent. It also came later when I was doing investigative work for some Glasgow lawyers, and was actually investigating current crime, as it were, or certainly cases that were coming to court. And you would meet the victims, and you would meet the families of victims. It's not always murder, obviously. It's more petty crime, but there were assaults, and there was and everything has an effect. The ripples do spread out from the initial crime, and you can't help but feel sorry for people. And yes, it did become. It does have an effect. I think you go one way or the other. You either develop the hard outer shell, which doesn't mean that you don't care. It just means that you can deflect the sadness and the tragedy off, still affect you, or you can go the way that you obviously went, and I went to an extent, and that you take it in. And it has an effect on you, and you have to turn your back on it and stop doing what you're doing.
And we'll get to this later, but it just strikes me about the scene where your heroine in Thunder Bay, Rachel, is interviewing a woman who obviously her daughter was killed, I believe, and Rachel's inner monologue is about empathy, and but she's still waiting for the money quote from the person she's interviewing so she can get done with the story.
Yeah. She knows she's got to do her job. That is her job. It doesn't mean that she doesn't care, but she knows what the media industry wants from her. And throughout the book, she's kicking against that as well, as you know.
Yeah.
But she does know, and just because she recognises that the quote that the woman finally gives is the money quote, doesn't mean that she doesn't care.
Absolutely. It's just interesting. I can't tell you when I read that, though, because as I still technically do a form of journalism here, right? I interview people, and you're always kind of looking, though. It's that second sense of a journalist for the money quote, as we call it, and for that thing that you can hang your hat on with the story. Maybe it's part of the lead, but so when I read that, I just have to tell you, Douglas, I was just like, man, obviously this guy's a journalist. He knows. So, well, so you started kind of feeling a need to move on from there, and if moving along here, you broke into fiction with your Dave McCall series. If I'm not jumping ahead too fast, can you kind of give me the transition idea for that?
Yeah, the last true crime book that I wrote was in 2009, and that was Glasgow's Black Heart, and that was the history of Glasgow's underworld. It was an alternative history of Glasgow, effectively, filtered through the crime from 1800 onwards. Now, once I'd done that, I'd pretty much exhausted everything that interested me, within the historical crime, and I'd always wanted to write fiction. In fact, there are some police officers in Scotland who say I was writing fiction all along. So it took 2 or 3 years, and I wrote the Davy McCall books. There were 4 of them, and everything that I'd learned in investigating for the solicitors and researching for the true crime filtered into the Davy McCall books, because Davy McCall, when I started to to think about it, I thought, what am I going to write about? I don't want to do a police procedural because Ian Rankin and Val McDermid, Alex Gray were all doing these and doing them very well. So I thought, I can't add anything to that. What can I do? So I took it from the point of view of the criminals, because I'd met a lot of Glasgow criminals in particular, and had learned a lot about how they think and what their lives were like. So everything I'd learned went into the Davy McCall books. They are all fiction. There is nobody in the Davy McCall books that is based on any actual person, whether it's a criminal or a police officer or a newspaperman. Everybody's fiction. Everything that happens there is fiction, but hopefully there's a reality to the base. They're still thrillers. They're not documentaries, but hopefully there is a reality in the in the underlying atmosphere of it that comes through.
Did this initial foray into fiction, did you just pivot off of your current publisher you were working with true crime for that, or did that at least get you entree to a different publisher, or how did that work?
No, I found it more difficult to get the fiction accepted. Mainstream, who were predominantly my publishers for the true crime, didn't really do a lot of fiction, and they didn't fancy the Davy McCall book at all. So I might as well admit it. So it took about, I think it was 3 years before I found a publisher, and eventually it was a small publisher in Edinburgh who took it on, and everything just grew from there, really.
And you did, about 4 books in the Davy McCall arc, is that right?
Did 4 Davy McCalls. Unusually, the final one was written first.
Oh.
And I was trying to get an agent. I couldn't get an agent for years. I have one now, but I couldn't get one for years. And I was trying to get an agent and a bigger publisher, and somebody was interested in it. And he said, look, I think this is good, but I'm really interested in how all these characters came together. So I went back and wrote the first one, which became Blood City.
Oh.
And the storyline in the 4 books stretches from 1980 to the year 2000 in the city, and it talks about Davy McCall, who is what we call a hard man here, but there's more to him. The reader knows that there's more to him than that many of the characters in the storylines know, and he really wants to get out. And I'm a big fan of westerns.
Oh, me too.
And I always say that the Davy McCall books are essentially westerns set in a Glasgow street. And I take that, so he's the gunfighter with a past, essentially, who doesn't want to, he's done with his trade, but he can't get out. So that was the approach that I took with Davy McCall, even although in the first one he's only 18 years or 21, I think, and he ages over the course of the 4 books up to the year 2000. So the final one was written first, so I knew where the rest of the series was going to go, and I was contracted for 4, so there was always only going to be 4.
That fascinates me, and I have a soft spot for westerns. Regular listeners will know that my grandfather, he wrote over 50 years. He wrote over 30 westerns. We were from Oklahoma. I don't know if that rings a bell necessarily with you in Scotland, but in Oklahoma, that was Indian territory, and he was an historian as well. Yes. So, and one of my favorite movies is Rio Bravo, which with the filmmaker John Carpenter turned into how many times did John Carpenter go to that well? And I did this. It's funny because Douglas, because I took in my series, I took one and I based it into a Western. I basically thought, well, I want to kind of try a spin of different genres throughout my series. And so and the one that I did with the Western, it may not have been my most successful, but it's the one that I just love the most. And I even I stole it, and I don't think my grandpa would mind, he's now deceased. I borrowed a couple of characters from his most successful book and put them in there for a little bit, just as a little cameo. So I am always so excited when I hear a fellow writer talk about a love of Westerns. Isn't it fantastic? Westerns. Do you have a particular favorite?
Shane's my favorite. I knew you were going to ask me that. Shane. Shane, and I know that's not terribly original, but Shane is one of the books that influenced me greatly in my writing, and not just the book, but I love the movie as well. But certainly, the whole feel of Schaefer's work in Shane just shadows a lot of what I do very often. I'd love to write a Western, love to be able to write one.
I want to read it if you do. Let me ask you a question about Shane. Then you ready? I bet you know the question.
No.
This is kind of a bone of contention amongst a lot of people. At least it is for me. I even memorialized it in one of my books. I said, you can tell a type of person by how they think Shane actually ended. Did Shane live, or did Shane die?
It depends the way you want it. He goes up into the mountains. Mm-hmm. He has the call of the faraway hills. Up he goes. Did he die? Was he dead from the beginning? Which is a facet that's explored by Clint Eastwood in both High Plains Drifter and Pale Rider. Pale Rider is very much an unofficial remake of Shane. So was he dead? From the beginning, was he the Angel of Death? So you could say that, but yeah, I don't want to say. I have no idea. I like to think that Shane is still up there. He's still riding up there in those faraway hills. And it's, again, to go back to Davy McCall, if anybody ever reads them and gets to the end, you will see the influence of Shane once again in how the 4 books end.
Oh, you have just, I can't believe this. I just get through Thunder Bay and now I've got to get 4 more. My goodness. All right. Fair enough. You talked me into it. You talked me into it. Okay. Well, speaking of that, so let's shift gears a little bit more. So you got through those 4 wonderful Davy McCall books, and then you got into Dominic Quest, correct? Is that the name?
Yes.
Now, what is that all about?
Well, the Davy McCall books were very, very serious. They were humour. I'm a great believer in there's humour everywhere. There was certainly humour in the Davy McCall books, not necessarily from Davy because he didn't say much. Everything was internalised with him. And once I got the end, I thought I really need to have a change of pace. And when I started writing fiction, I gave myself 3 rules. Rule number 1 is I would never have a character with an unusual name. So I came up with Dominic Quest with an E at the end. And rule number 2 is that I wouldn't write a serial killer book. So the second Dominic Quest book is a serial killer book. And rule number 3 was that rules 1 and 2 don't necessarily apply, so I was all right. And so Dominic Quest was a different approach. And because Davy was very much steeped in reality, there were still thrillers, but the real base, I wanted a change of pace. So if I wanted to have a shootout in the middle of a public park in the East End of Glasgow, which is not something that I would do with a Davy McCall book, but I did it with Dominic Quest. And that was the idea. And I started to write the first one, which was called The Dead Don't Boogie, with Raymond Chandler's line about, if you feel your story slowing down, have 2 guys kick the door in with guns in their hand.
Exactly.
And that was my rule with writing Dominic Quest. So I wrote this book and I had all these set pieces. I had the shootout in East End Park. I had another shootout in a car park near the Clyde. I had bodies dropping everywhere. I had plot twists. I had characters coming in and out. I had 2 guys kicking the door in with guns in their hand. And I got to, I think, 35 to 40,000 words, and I had to stop and say to myself, I really need to think of a storyline here, because I didn't know what it was all about. I knew what Dominic would be, which is he's a kind of private eye. He doesn't say he's a private eye. He says he's an odd job man. And I knew he would have a past. In his case, it was a drug addiction, which he had. I knew that he would be a big film fan. And everything that he does is filtered through popular movie culture and TV. I knew that he would have a love of film, of film scores, because this is me. All of this is me. And I also knew that he would be so smart-mouthed that it would get him into trouble. So. And his brain is actually running before his mouth, or his mouth is running before his brain's in gear. Sorry, and he comes back, and finds himself in trouble because he can't help himself. So that I knew all about that, but I didn't have a storyline. So eventually I came up with something, and I was able to retrofit the first 35 to 40,000 words to fit what I'd come up with. But it was never going to be a realistic book. It was always going to be fun. It has its dark moments, and it's still a thriller, but I designed the two of them to be fun. And I would have liked to have continued with Dominic Quest, but unfortunately the second one didn't sell very well.
So is that your barometer? If it doesn't sell, you're out. You're not going to give it another try.
Well, it's certainly some publishers, but always.
oh, I see. I mean,
no, that's fair. That's unfair. But you can't. You can't. If people aren't going to buy a book, you can't keep churning out series because the publishers just can't. The margins are so tight now,
right.
That certainly publishers can't produce books that if people don't want to read them, and it's unfortunate because I still have a soft spot for Dominic, and I would love to do more Dominic Quests.
I think that's
but you move on.
I think that's what I was getting at. That you seem to really be in love with the character for a lot of good reasons, and it just I understand how it is when one of your barons just isn't working out, and you have to put it on the side. Now you did a one-off in between that and Rachel Connolly's series, correct? Is there a one-off book?
Yes.
Now, what was that, real quick?
The Janus run. I was challenged by a fellow crime writer, Craig Robertson, to write something that wasn't set in Glasgow. And he said, in fact, don't set it in Scotland. So I came up with, because of my love of movies, I came up with this fast-paced conspiracy chase thriller set in New York. Oh. And I went one further. I didn't even have any Scottish characters in it. And it would have been easier if I could have done that. But I with everything I write, I try to challenge myself. Even with each of the 4 David McCall books was different from the last. Although there was an overriding story arc and there was continuing characters. Each of the Dominic Quest books was different. And the challenge with the Janus run was, could I make New York come alive, even although I'm not a native New Yorker? I don't know if anybody's noticed that with the accent, but I'm not actually from.
You sound like Brooklyn to me. I don't know.
So I did the Janus run, and again it was paying nodding towards the 70s conspiracy thrillers that I like, the Parallax run and 3 Days of the Condor.
Oh yeah,
Marathon Man. All of these, it's all in there, although it's set in the present day. And I thoroughly enjoyed writing it. I think I pulled it off. I'm sure native New Yorkers would read it and say, no, he didn't quite. But, I think I'm almost there with it. I am proud of it. I like the book. I did get people from New York to read it, and they picked up a couple of things which were changed. But obviously, it was time to move on again and time for another challenge. And that's where Rebecca Connolly came in.
Yes, and as we get to her, and I might have called her Rachel earlier. I apologize, Rebecca, but because I call her Bex, I remember that now. When you mentioned 3 Days of the Condor and Parallax View, see, there's another book by you, and now I have to go read. If those are your influences, my goodness, I'm going to be very poor at the end of this, buying all your books. Well, let me just share a summary, if you don't mind, if you'll suffer through my reading this summary. But this is Thunder Bay. So the summary is, when reporter Rebecca Connolly gets a tip that suspected murderer Roddy Drummond will be returning to the island of Storm, she smells a story. Though never convicted in the death of his girlfriend, and I believe that's Mary, correct? Is that how you pronounce it? It's
Vary. It's Vary.
Vary, okay.
Vary. MH in the Gaelic is pronounced V.
Thank you. Okay, 15 years earlier, Drummond is still guilty in the eyes of many islanders, and his return for his mother's funeral is sure to stir up old resentments, and possibly even violence. In addition to following Roddy's story, Rebecca has a personal reason for going to Storm. Her father grew up on the island, but he left when he was young and never returned. His refusal to speak of Storm or say what drove him away raises Rebecca's suspicions and drives her to seek out whatever mystery lurks in her father's past. Defying her editor, Rebecca joins forces with local photographer Chaz Weimark to dig into the mystery surrounding Barry's death, and the unexplained last words, Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is the name of the secluded spot on the west coast of the island where, according to local lore, the souls of the dead set off into the afterlife. When a string of violent events erupts across the island, Rebecca discovers the power of secrets, and she must decide what to bury and what to bring into the light. Okay. First of all, I don't know who writes your blurbs, if you wrote that or not, but no, that's fantastic. That just pulls it all together really well for me.
It's really good. I didn't write it. That's an incredible blurb. I thoroughly love that blurb.
I am terrible at writing those for mine. I've been asked to write them, and I'm just like, it's like I want to say everything. Of course, that's what the book is. But so the thing that struck me that I wanted to ask you right off the bat about this, having just gone through your publishing history, what made you shift to a female protagonist?
It's the challenge thing again. The whole thing is a challenge. Could I write as a 20-something female? Because again, that the more eagle-eared of your listeners will note that I'm not a female, even although I'm just barely out of my 20s. So,
I wonder which photo we should use on the blog post about this one. You let me know, okay, Douglas?
I hope you've got Photoshop. But other photo editing applications are available. So it was the challenge of not only could I create a believable female protagonist, but also could I create an island, because the island of Storm, we'll call it that. It's Stoyrm, and apparently that is pronounced Stirrum. And that's Gaelic for storm. So we'll continue to call it Storm because it's easier. It doesn't exist. It's a fiction. And again, here's another one of my influences for you. Ed McBain and the 87th Precinct novels.
Yep.
He created a city that became so believable that you would not believe that it didn't exist. And it became a character in this vast series of novels, just as much as Corella and Kling and Meyer and the rest of the boys in the precinct. And could I do that? Could I create an island that people not only would wish was real, but also became a character in the book in its own right? And again, I hope I've pulled that off. Do you think I've pulled it off?
I think you have. And it's interesting. I had a question lined up kind of related to that. I was going to ask you this, just background-wise. My series goes from a very small town in the American Midwest that does not exist, obviously, in real life, and to a small island off the coast of Florida called Key West, which does exist. My character throughout the series toggles between those. And I do that because, frankly, I find the smaller settings more manageable for me. That's for my limitations as a writer, perhaps. But is there something about writing about smaller settings, villages, and islands that you find challenging or more helpful, or both?
It's helpful. It's the claustrophobia. It's this idea of isolation that I think helps with particular storylines. It doesn't help with them all, but certainly with this storyline. So you have this self-contained community on the island, where it's glib to say everybody knows each other. They don't, but a lot of people do know each other. And in comes this outsider who is Rebecca, trying to get to the bottom of not one but two mysteries. But also Roddy Drummond is very much an outsider by now because of what happened 15 years before. And even although he was cleared of the murder charge on the Scottish not proven verdict, we have three verdicts. I don't know if your listeners will know this, but we have three verdicts in Scotland. We have not guilty, guilty, and not proven. And the general view of not proven is that we know you did it, but couldn't quite prove it, so go away and don't do it again. Now that's an oversimplification of what is a very ancient verdict. In Scotland, it used to be proven and not proven. We didn't have not guilty or guilty. And when that was changed, not proven was retained for some reason. But we have it for balance, because in Scotland, juries are 15 strong. not 12. And somebody can be convicted on a simple majority. So 8 people could think you were guilty or not guilty, and 7 could think the opposite. And you're either convicted or freed. But the not proven gives you another safety valve there for that. So anyway, Roddy Drummond got off on the not proven, and he's returning for the first time in 15 years. So he's very much an outsider coming into this world that he had left. So that's the sort of thing that appealed to me. And again, if I could go back to the Western, it's like the small Western town.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And the stranger is coming into town.
Yep.
And uncovering all sorts of things.
And I, by the way, my listeners are probably going, Alex, enough about your own series, but I just love to talk to a fellow writer about. But mine started where he came to this tiny town, a small college. Nobody knew him, but everybody knew who he was before he got there. And this happened to me. I went to work at a very small town for a small college years ago, and everybody knew who I was, and it creeped me out because I hadn't met these people. But so I started incorporating little nods to The Prisoner. the Patrick McGoohan, right? And be seeing you, and people started saying that. So my character started saying, "Be seeing you." But so when I hear this, so let me ask you a kind of what I guess would be called inappropriately a tactical question. Then, as a writer, that town that I actually was in, that I based my fictional town on, it was so remote at the time. This was 15 years ago. We had no cell service. So I got into a habit of writing this series without cell phones because I think cell phones ruin most mysteries. But how do you feel about that? Was that an aspect of what you were doing here with the island as well, about communication? Or do you disagree about that contention about cell phones?
No, I don't disagree. The modern technology really gets in the way of a good mystery book quite often, unless you find a way to make it work for you. It wasn't. It was just a lucky byproduct of setting on an island. I hadn't reasoned that out, that you would have this notion that and I don't. In fact, I'm trying to think back, because remember, Thunder Bay was written 2 or 3 years ago. I don't think anybody actually uses a cell phone.
Well, I think I noticed that, actually. That's what I was wondering about. I don't really think there was any cell phone culture to worry about there. So I love that.
They would have. I mean, realistically, the islands will have cell reception, so it will be there. I'm going to be. I know I'm aware I'm talking to American audience because we call it mobile. So
I beg your pardon. Yes.
No, that's all right. It's an American audience. I'll speak American. Yeah, so it didn't really come into my mind. It's just, as I say, it's a lucky byproduct. I think there is somebody uses a cell. There's a road traffic accident, and I think the police officer is using a cell there, but that's about it. But it didn't feature in the storyline. Nobody needed to use one. That's my point. There was no reason for anybody to use one, and I think that's why it didn't come up in my mind.
I'm so glad to hear that answer too, because they really, to me, they really are story killers to a degree. So shifting back just for a moment back to Rebecca, did you have any difficulty to your mind writing in the feminine voice? I asked because your previous book, you asked New Yorkers to say, how am I doing on this? Did you have a similar process with writing in the feminine voice? Did you actually ask women to read it and say, does this ring true or no?
I didn't ask the question bluntly. I asked people to read the book, and as I always do, we all have our beta readers. And my approach was just, I approached her like I would approach any character. Any writer approaches their characters. It's like a method actor, I think. And, so you get into their heads, whether it's male or female. And so the plus side is that Rebecca doesn't exist. She is completely a figment of my imagination. So I created her. The one thing that I didn't want to do, which apparently is a mistake that male writers can have when writing female characters, is have her admiring herself in the mirror. And this is something that I hadn't thought about it when I did it, but this is something that's been said to me subsequently. You didn't have her, admiring herself in the mirror. So my approach was just with just as with any other character. I kind of disagree with this idea, but strong female characters. Every character that you write should be strong. Even the weak characters should be strong, if that makes any kind of sense at all.
Yeah.
So that is always my approach. So the attention that I give is even. I refused to let the fact that I was male get in the way.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. Well, I've had my own challenges with it, but my problem has been I have been, unlike you, I've not been as forthright with my own craft as you in this regard, because I felt very self-conscious writing feminine characters, and people who know me well in my circle of friends found that surprising, because actually here we go. Some of my best friends are women, but most of a good chunk of my friends are, I have very good female-male relationships with women who are buddies. So I feel like I understand the rhythms of how they speak and their thought process and those things. But I still felt incredibly self-conscious at times trying to do that. So.
Well, the people everybody who read it are people I trust. And I know that they will give me the strong feedback. They won't play to my ego at all. And yes, I was aware when I gave it to the women readers that there was every possibility that they would come back and say she doesn't ring true. They didn't come back with that. They said that she did. So it's not something that I rationalised too much. Whatever it is I did, I've pulled it off, thankfully, and I'm grateful because I really like Rebecca as a character.
Yeah.
She's young, but she has darkness in her, and again, I don't want to expand on that. You understand because you've read the book. You know what's happened to her. So she has darkness within her, and in the second book, The Blood is Still. That kind of deepens as well, but she doesn't lose her sense of self. She doesn't lose her sense of purpose. It's all there, and she keeps going. And she also has a sense of humour, which I think is very, very important.
It seems a thread with your work that there's a certain black humor that obviously is a companion to you. Is that a fair statement? That how you are?
Yes. I dialed it back a bit for Thunder Bay. I've got to say that there's not as much in Thunder Bay, but certainly in the second one there's a bit more, because I felt the characters. I was more comfortable with the characters. I think the characters themselves were more comfortable with each other, and so the humour starts to come out. But it's still, the second one is still is quite a dark read with a lot of light moments.
Well, I think that's very innate with former journalists or journalists too. The dark humor. You see so much horror and so much absurdity. The black humor is just a natural part of it. Speaking of that, really quickly here, I realize we've been going on a bit, and I don't want to keep you too long, although I'm really enjoying the conversation. You have some subtle and not so subtle jabs at the state of modern journalism, because of course Rebecca is a journalist in the book, and like I said, as a former weekly newspaper editor, I can relate. So just curious, how do you feel as a former journalist about the age of clickbait and shrinking newsrooms? Do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's dreadful. I think it's bad for the reader. It's bad for democracy.
Yes.
Really, really bad for democracy. And newspapers I'm thinking about just are not able now to provide the service. I was a weekly newspaper journalist and editor as well. And in the town that we circulated, we were known as the fourth emergency service. So even local councillors sent people to us because they couldn't get anything sorted for their constituent, so they would send them to us because they knew that we would manage to get it fixed. So that's all gone because the staffing level isn't there.
Right.
The time isn't there. It's all clickbait, as you pointed out. You're getting press releases rewritten, and sometimes not even rewritten. And just put in. And basically, quite often now, it's all the news that fits. And I think that because you have pre-planned pages, and the copy, the stories are flowed into those, and you write the stories are written to fit that pre-plan. So that's when I say it's all the news that fits.
Right.
And I think that's very, very sad, and it is not good for the reader. It's not good for the communities. It's not good for the nations. We need a strong and independent and vibrant press. And unfortunately now we're not getting that quite often.
You know, in the United States, we actually enshrine the fourth estate, as we call it, the press, in our
Yeah.
Constitution. But it's interesting
Yeah.
that there's a lot of Americans who don't seem to understand that, and they think that they following the line from a lot of politicians who shall remain nameless, that the journalist is somehow a hindrance to our democracy, when in actuality, as you said, just like your weekly paper, by the way, my weekly paper, the same, people could go
Yep.
to, if the government or the authorities, whoever they are, or corporations, weren't towing the line to do the right thing, they could come to us. And now it's... boy, I mean, you just see so many things where it's obvious that corporations hold such sway, and now government is starting to hold such sway. And there was by the way, there was, I imagine you've heard this years ago, that not too far ago, within the past 3 or 4 years, there was a study that said that a lot of young people today don't believe we necessarily need to be a democracy, and they don't believe they believe that the government should control the press, which just astounded me.
Yeah, well, there's some say that they do. Certainly here in the UK, there's quite a strong feeling that the government does control the press, and I've got to say, there is a certain amount of truth in that, but it's not that they control it. It's just that the staff level is not there in order to do what they should be doing. And I think at one point in Thunder Bay, Rebecca comes out with the line that, you know, the press should afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted.
Yeah.
And I'm afraid that in the main that there are certain exceptions to this, obviously, and there are a lot of people working in the industry who want to do a good job, and they really do, but they can't. And there are some who are managing to do a good job despite all the odds. But it's a very, very sad reflection of our democracies that, you know, our media is held in such low regard, but they have themselves to blame to an extent for this, unfortunately.
Yeah, there's a lot of that. Well, and we could go off on that, but I know we're closing in on time here. But I had a couple more points. If you're still enthusiastic,
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So talking about the craft, if you'll pardon a word that is fraught with potential pretentiousness, but do you have a certain pattern for breaking a new book? You know, as in, do you have it set in type in your head to a large degree before you write it, or is it a more organic process?
Oh, I would say it's organic, but I think the correct word is chaotic with me. I have no clue half the time where the book is going. I will have an idea for a beginning. I might have some notion for what will happen somewhere along the line, or a set piece here or a scene there, and even the characters will start to grow as I write. But that's as far as I go. Now, with Thunder Bay, it was unusual in that I had an idea as to how it would end right from the beginning. So I knew what the final scene would be from the beginning. I hadn't decided what the solution would be. I hadn't decided what the answers to these questions would be. And they all grew organically as I wrote. But that's the beauty of having so many drafts, because you can go back and retrofit. If you have an idea on page 215 that needs to be reflected on page 50, it's very easy to go back and fix it. Yeah. Stephen King talks about the boys in the boiler room, I think it is, that he talks about. And I kind of agree with that. And what my theory is that they know where the book is going. They just don't tell me. It's on a need-to-know basis until I come to write that particular bit. Totally. And then they tell me.
Same. Absolutely. I don't know if you've heard the plotter versus pantser. You know,
oh yes.
I just like you. My first book, I knew what the last scene would be exactly, but I had no earthly idea how I'd get there. But after a million drafts, I got there, and I'm with you though. as I tell people who ask me about my work, I just say, well, I like to start with just have interesting characters and put them in mysterious or thrilling or suspenseful situations. But
Yes.
I find it difficult to go the Agatha Christie route. Although, frankly, after seeing Knives Out, that film, I'm kind of wanting to try that because as I've said, I've tried to do, the Western version of my series, and there's kind of some future and all. So I want to do that. But Douglas, one thing I wanted to do, I wanted to share, if you'll tolerate me reading a couple of lines, is that all right with you?
Of course.
From your book. Well, some authors are like, "Oh, Alex, please don't butcher my story." All right, but I wanted to share this. This is a sentence. This is early in the book, and it's looking out across a bay or a sound. There was another silence between them, while around them the world played its own symphony, the soft melody of the breeze, the glissando of the waves as they caressed the yellow sand at the bottom of the hill, the bass rumble of the ferry engine as it pulled away, the percussive cry of a gull. And that's just that's a bit. It's so interesting and so delightful for me in the midst of a suspenseful thriller to find that it's also written with such care. And I wanted to ask you if I'm not, by the way, I'm not trying to dump syrup all over you. I'm sincere, but I just want to ask you, when you're putting the book together and you're drafting it, does the prose flow that way from you easily, or is that something you kind of get the skeleton out there and then you go put meat on the bones later?
It's mostly the latter. Sometimes a phrase will come into your head fully formed, and down it goes. But that one in particular, again, I'm casting my mind back, was one that I added because I wanted to have this lyrical feel to Thunder Bay, which I continue in the next one as well, and it was just something. And again, it's going back to the method writing. I put myself on that small hill on this island, looking out there, and remember, it doesn't exist. It's all in my head. And what would I hear? What would I see? What would I smell? And it just occurred to me that that's the way the sounds would be. That it would be a sort of music,
right,
in the atmosphere. And that sounds terribly pretentious. And those who know me know I'm not really like that. But it sometimes they come fully formed. Other times you've got to hone them and chip away at them.
Totally understand. I couldn't let it go. I underlined that in my copy and just said, and I read it 3 times because I was just like, yes, this is. Well, one of my favorite films is Local Hero. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that one.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, so you'll forgive me, but I guess my mind was subconsciously making it look like the setting for Local Hero, you see. And then when you did that, when I got to that line, I was like, oh my, yeah, this is really working for me. Anyway, again, I don't mean to embarrass you with that, but I just want to tell you that it really stood out for me. And as we're getting close here, I have to just tell you.
Embarrass me, I love it. More.
Okay, more. Okay, okay. I've got a quick anecdote for you that I want to drop on you. I'm a big fan of the late Anthony Bourdain, travel writer, raconteur. I have one of my most listened to books it became a companion for me before he passed on. Now it's a little painful to listen to, but it was him reading his breakthrough book, Restaurant Confidential. But he tells the story when he was very down on his heels before he was famous, and he was a drug addict and he was having issues. He needed a job, and he heard that there was a new steakhouse coming in New York City, and he was kind of a journeyman. Well, the owner of that steakhouse, I'm getting to a point here, Douglas, don't worry. There's the owner of that steakhouse was a Scottish tycoon, basically, of restaurants. I don't know the name, and he didn't really elaborate. But he got an interview, and it was with the new general manager and this Scottish owner, right? So he goes in and he cleans up, puts on his best suit of clothes, and he sits down, and they have a great conversation, and they're talking about food, and they're talking about restaurants and all these things, and he's going, it's just going so well. And then at the very end, it's like, we're starting to wrap up, and he asked me, do you have any questions? And he said, he asked a few pointed questions to look smart because he wanted to get the job. And then the Scottish owner said, all right, what do you know about me? And so So Bourdain is like, ask him to repeat it several times, and forgive my bad Scottish, but he asked him to repeat it several times, and he said, I didn't know anything about him, so I just decided, come clean, tell the truth. He says, absolutely nothing. Their face, you already know, don't you? Their faces fell, and they started shuffling papers and said, well, we'll be in touch. Thank you so much. He gets out on the street. He's walking down there. He's going, what did I do wrong? And then he said, oh my God, he didn't say, what do you know about me? He said, what do you know about meat?
Well, there we are. That's the differences in the accents, isn't it? The language difference.
But the reason, and that's the reason I dropped that was one, I've always wanted to tell that to a Scottish person. But the second one I wanted to get to is there's a point to it, and I'm glad I didn't until I got in the conversation with you. I debated doing that, but you seemed like such a charming, fun guy. I thought I would do that. But so I get to that question because I know you don't particularly, or I'm going to assume you don't write for anybody but yourself and the audience that made you or that is supporting you, which is your home audience. But do you ever think about, I mean, your dialogue is great, and it's obvious that you've had a lot of life experience with people, and you've got an ear for it. And each character, you don't have a lot of problem reading the characters in conversation, knowing who's talking. Sometimes you read authors and you're like, if he didn't say he said here, I don't know who said it. That's not a problem with you at all. But is there any question in your mind now that you are getting outside of Scotland about how to maintain the dialogue and the storytelling? But do you feel yourself needing to, like, I couldn't pronounce a couple of the names already, right? Do you feel a need to dial back on the Scottish dialect and idioms out of fear of it being impenetrable? That was a long question. Sorry.
It's a very good question, and I think the answer is to an extent yes, because you don't want to lose the flavour. You want to keep the background. You want to keep the strong background going. But to a certain extent, one of the criticisms I saw of Thunder Bay was from a non-Scottish reader, and it was because there was too much Gaelic in it. Now, I don't have people speaking Gaelic in it, but there are Gaelic phrases because they do speak Gaelic in the Highlands and Islands. Not everybody, but they do speak it. If you go up there, you see that the road signs are both in English and in Gaelic. But they didn't like that. Now, I took that on board, and I thought, well, I'll watch that in future, because the last thing you want to do is lose your reader.
Right.
And you've got to be aware that not even Scots can be confused by Gaelic because they don't speak it. So yes, it's a very good question, and the short answer, I've given you a long answer just to say yes, I am very much aware of that, and I have dialed it back a bit, but it's still there. Because each book, the idea behind the Rebecca Connolly books is that each one will reflect some aspect either of Scottish history in some way, or mythology. Thunder Bay, it was the mythology of the island and the Highland clearances. When the noble families cleared a lot of their land of the ordinary folk in order to make way for grazing sheep. And a lot of them went across the Atlantic to Canada and America, as you probably know. So the great Scottish diaspora, they call it.
Right.
So that was Thunder Bay. And the next one, it's the 45, the Bonnie Prince Charlie, the Jacobite Rebellion, and Culloden, which reflects on the modern day crime. So that's the theory. So all of that is there. That's the basis of the plot lines. So I won't be dialing back in that, but certainly perhaps dialing back a bit on the use of Gaelic.
And that gets me back to where we started, just about where I asked you about Tartan Noir. If you could flesh that out for me, then, because it sounds to me like you're trying to make the point about. This sounds a little clinical, but your readers can purpose your stories and don't have to be heavily knowledgeable necessarily about Scotland, right? I believe, sorry to steal your thunder, but I believe you said previously these books are basically written that they could be set anywhere. Am I paraphrasing that correctly?
No, yes, that's exactly right. I think practically any book could be set anywhere. The storyline, sorry. Let me just